So welcome, all of you. Welcome, everyone on Zoom to the return of our Bible study in person. It's, it's been more than 2 years, 2.5 years since we've done this. And there's something special about gathering in person, or at least having the option to gather in person, that I think, to me, has been one of the biggest losses, the biggest hurts over this past couple of years, feeling so isolated. And it actually is pretty appropriate what we're going to be talking about today, because isolation is part of the story of the two women we'll be talking about. But what are we talking about? What is our Bible study today? This time, we are going to be talking about women of the Bible. And women of the Bible is an amazingly broad topic, and it's also an incredibly challenging topic. Why? Because we've studied some of the major women. Okay, we've talked about Esther, we've talked about Ruth, we know about Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of Jesus. Some of these women are given a little bit more flesh on the bones. But here's the reality that we also know. Most women in the Bible do not receive that attention. Part of it is because the Bible was written in a time where women were simply not seen as equal members of society. So their stories were not given the full weight. We often don't get names for the women in these stories. We often don't know much about their circumstances. So when we attempt to study women of the Bible, it is with some measure of trepidation or challenge, because we have to figure out something about the story based both on what is said and what's not said. And that's part of what we'll be looking at as we look at these stories. When we take in a story of a particular woman, like for instance today, you have the hemorrhaging woman and the bent over woman, you try to appreciate what is the text telling us about them based on the data that it's giving, and then what is missing. So we'll be looking at that. We're going to be looking at how these women in general help to shape healthy relationships in our community, and also healthy relationships of faith. They represent a lot of healthy relationships of faith and movement towards healing. So this is some of the stuff we'll be looking at. And then as we look at these greater stories, and please come in, just feel free with me. As we look at these stories, we want to sort of challenge some of the paradigms we've been given that still exist in modern times for women. For example, how many of you were either raised in a church or know churches where women are still not allowed to be in leadership positions or to be ministers? That's true. There's a lot of churches that do that. And so a lot of that comes from perceptions of what the Bible says or doesn't say, or what it says, I think. And so we're going to be looking at how these women's stories kind of open up a deeper appreciation of our own faith and our own connection to community, but also to challenge some of those models that maybe we've been given. So as we step into this first week, first of all, any questions about just in general studying women of the Bible? Has anyone studied in general, say, a course of women on the Bible? Okay, so Carol Williams is in the room. And let me just say, as we get started here, we are joined by now 8 people online. So it's Ann Galbraith, or 7 people, Bertie Wiest, Boyce Baldwin, Margaret Holbrook, Bonnie and Marcia, and Horty. So there's a lot of people in the room too. We're going to do our best to make sure that everyone is included. We'll try to talk one at a time. As I said, for those that joined just a couple minutes ago or recently, if you have a question, raise your hand. If I don't see you, unmute yourself and say, "Excuse me, Dan," and then I'll come to you. And I'm seeing Horty raising her hand now.
Can you let us know who's there with you, Dan?
Of course. So we have Cecily, Jane Wurst, Joe Beck, Dan and Sue Clark, Kathleen Edwards, Jay and Carol Williams, Honey D, Barbara Hollitz, and Ken Moore, all around the table here. So it's a pretty good attendance here. Let's see how we can, we'll see how this goes. Like I said, we'll be recording it, so hopefully the quality turns out okay. But any kind of initial questions or comments as we step into this study? Boyce?
I was just wondering, is there any way that we could either call or somehow know what the air is like up there. I would like to come up there, but I just thought, why go to a smoky
Check
area?
the weather app in the API.
Yeah, you can go on,
AQI.
there's a weather app, but also you can just Google air quality index or
Auburn.
air quality in Auburn, California. I did that this morning and it's excellent. It's really low right now.
And it's way better than it has been, boys.
Oh, yes.
People are out walking and we can see patches of blue sky and it
Oh,
doesn't smell like a barbecue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we have blue sky down here with some clouds, but I just thought, well, I didn't want to come up.
The car still smells, but we don't smell as much.
Thank
All
you.
right, well, let me get into some of the little bit of background for the two women we're going to be looking at today. So the first one is this woman with the hemorrhage. This is from the Gospel of Mark. Now, we talked about it before. We'll get into a little bit more detail today. So what are we given about her? We know that she's been bleeding for 12 years. And while it doesn't specifically say, the context suggests and scholars believe that her bleeding relates to what we would call a womanly issue, whether it be menstrual blood or postpartum blood. But for 12 years, she has been bleeding. And if you have ever read the Red Tent, or if you know anything about what happened when women were bleeding, it was a way of being ritually unclean. And so they would need to be isolated. So that's 12 years of isolation, 12 years of avoiding contact. And so as we hear her story, think about some of these things. Think about, because we know stories. If you know, like from the Old Testament, there's a story about a man named Naaman and others that when they get healed, there's this reticence on the part of some to actually accept the healing. Okay, well, who gave you that authority? Who told you you were healed? And it makes you wonder. This woman, when she receives her physical healing from Jesus, what in this story tells us or might suggest as to how would it be like for her? Would people accept that she's no longer contagious? Would that be an issue? Would her physical healing go a long way in sort of repairing or healing her spiritual or emotional healing? I think what we've been emerging out of over the last 2 years with our own isolation is not a bad connector here to what it's like when we are finally given permission, say physically, to sort of come back together and what's like inside. I know I've seen a lot of different reactions, say from kids in school. You have to almost learn how to relate to people again. Yeah. And some of us don't really want to. Some of us are like this way. The introverts in the room are like, yes, this has been my 40 years. But then, there's a time when we come out. So as we look at this particular woman with her bleeding, how does her physical healing perhaps correlate to her spiritual or emotional healing? Okay. And then the second woman, the one who's bent over, it doesn't give us a lot of details. We don't know name, we don't know age, we don't know why it happened, we don't even know when. Well, I guess we know a when in the sense of we know that she's had it for 18 years. We don't know how old she is, so we don't know if it started at birth or wherever. But it's this bent overness, okay? And it's like there's something very powerful about that bent overness. And we're going to look at how the healing takes place. And what in her relationship with Jesus, how her healing, allowed her, to stand up tall, and what that represents, both physically, but also spiritually and even metaphorically. And a lot of us, I think what we'll find in these women is a lot of ways that we can relate to where they start from and where they go, where their healing takes them, and the identity that they're given, and the way Jesus sees them. That's such a key. In a world that doesn't even give them a name and doesn't even give them much information, Jesus seems to be one who is so keen and so able to see past all that stuff. And it's really powerful. Even with only a couple verses, we get so much information. Okay, so we're going to be looking at her and see, we don't know before she came to the synagogue that day, we don't know what she was saying, but we know that after she was healed, she went out praising. She was singing the praises. So it's like that. What does that tell us about what healing does? Okay, these are some of the things we'll be looking at. So we will try to keep these classes, because with the live classes, and I have a second class now afterwards, the faith renewal class, we're going to try to keep these a little tighter than we were doing it when we were just Zoom. And I think that's helpful. Hour to an hour and 15 minutes is what our target is. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep the conversation going. And boys, I think you look so cool with that. I wish everyone could see your picture, but if they watch the video, they will. He's got these sunglasses on. That's are AI kind of sunglasses. Anyway, any questions or comments as we step into as we want to get into reading about these two particular stories today? Carol?
I noticed a great contrast in the first one in Mark. Jesus had absolutely nothing to do with it, where she was the one that initiated. And in the John one, Jesus is the initiator.
Yes. Oh, that's such a good noticing. Did everyone hear what Carol said? That there's this contrast in these stories. And if you remember from when we studied the Gospels, and it's pretty much true in all the Gospels, most of the healings are a two-way street. It's not just Jesus distributing healing power, but it's something in the faith and the approach and even the initiative often of the one needing healing that allows healing to take place. Okay, there's something about that. But these two stories appear to have a contrast where the first woman absolutely takes the initiative. And she's this unclean person and she goes right into the crowd to touch his cloak. But then the second woman appears to take less initiative. We're going to look at that. We're going to see what the differences might be or what the similarities even might be. Anyone else? Okay. Well, let's jump into it. They're pretty short readings. I think for the sake of clarity, we're going to have, or just for the test, actually, I'm going to have the first reading read in this room, and then I'm going to ask one of the Zoom people to read the second reading, and just let's see how the audio is. Okay, so the first reading is Mark chapter 5, verses 25 to 34. Could I get a volunteer from in the room to read that passage this morning? Dan's going to read the passage. Dan Carter.
Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before her and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
Thank you, Dan. Could everyone hear that okay online? Good, okay. Excellent. Then could I get a volunteer from the Zoom class to read the second passage, which is Luke chapter 13, verses 10 to 13. Bonnie? Sure you're unmuted. Bonnie, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay, there. Okay. 13, verses 10 to 13, is that what you said?
Luke
Okay.
Luke 13, 10 to 13, that's right.
Okay. Okay. Jesus was teaching on a Sabbath in one of the synagogues, and he saw before him a woman who for 18 years had suffered from weakness owing to her having a spirit in her. She was bent double and was wholly unable to raise herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said, "Woman, you are release from your weakness. He placed his hands on her, and she was instantly made straight and began to praise God.
Okay, thank you. Not a lot of details in that one. We'll get to that one. Okay, so let's start with the first story. The woman who was hemorrhaging. There's a lot of places to go with this, but the first question I have, just if you notice this, how does the way that Jesus stops and meets this woman contribute to her healing? How does the way that Jesus stops and meets her? She goes up and touches him, but then he stops. What does he do? What does he say that contributes to her healing? And think about where he is going. It's only a verse or two before, but where is he going? Anyone know? He's going to the house of Jairus, who's a big-time religious leader, to heal his daughter, who is deathly sick. She's at death's door. That's an emergency. Jesus is going there, but this woman stops him. How does the way he stops and meet her contribute to her healing?
Well, he directs 100% of his attention right to her.
Yeah, he doesn't, he sees her, okay? He doesn't ignore her. She is there. She has lived her whole life. This whole idea of a 12-year hemorrhage is a statement of saying, this is someone that nobody touches, that nobody has anything to do with. She has to stay isolated, okay? She has been. For her to do this, to even show up there, is a huge step. It's a huge risk, okay? Jesus is not thrown by that. He sees her. That's a part of her healing. How else? What else happens that contributes to her healing in this exchange between her and Jesus? One thing he says to her is quite important. Yeah.
Well, he says to her, your faith has made you whole, or is that the word?
Yes, it does. But there's actually one word he said, I believe, just prior to that. What does he call her?
Oh, my daughter.
Yes. He calls her daughter. Do you see? The healing is almost wrapped up in that one word. In the context of this story, where he is going to heal this important daughter, to call this woman daughter is a form of healing. Why is that healing? Just to call her daughter, why is it healing?
Acceptance.
Yes, that means she's back in the community. And that is so much of what healing is. It's not just physical. We could be physically fit. If we're isolated in this life, we know we are not fully alive. We are not whole. This is what we've been living through. For him to call her daughter is that way of saying, welcome back to the fold that I never felt you were not a part of. That's the radical healing and acceptance of Jesus. And that little word is such a key. It's such a key because it welcomes her back. It names her. She doesn't have a name, but she's got a designation. She's got a purpose. She's part of a family. 12 years she's been away. Now she's welcomed back. Okay. So then that's what Jesus does. He sees her. He calls her daughter. He acknowledges. But what does it say that she does that contributes to her healing? Yes, we know she reaches out and touches the cloak. There's a couple other things that she says that are very instructive. Or it says that she does. And now the big truck's coming up. So this will be a nice test of anyone have it? What does she say or do in the context of this story that contributes to her healing?
Well, she takes the initiative to say that if I just touch his cloth, I will be healed.
Yes. So it's an approach of faith. And so her initiative of faith and trust is a huge first step. What else does she do?
She trembles in fear.
She trembles in fear as she.
She feels she needs to tell the truth.
Yes.
What was that?
What does it say she tells?
The whole truth.
The whole truth. That is huge. That's huge.
You told him the whole truth.
The whole truth. She just opens up. Now, sometimes we think of that expression, whole truth. You might sort of have a bit of a negative connotation, as if we're admitting to something, to faults, and that could be. But think of it in this context, there's no indication that she's done anything wrong. But what we know about her is that no one has likely had any contact with her who has ever cared about what her truth is. To have relationship like that, where you are invited to be your full, whole self, is one of the most healing things we know. And in any of you who have had long-term relationships and loving relationships, even if they've gone like this, that reality of deep truth sharing is one of the most intimate and loving things and healing things that we can possibly know as humans. So in a sense, her healing is so much about being welcomed back into the fold of humanity, of just being a part of something. And it's not some magical release. You know, it's the physical drying up of the blood is certainly a part of this. But really, the story spends much more time on focusing on her relationship to Jesus and her relationship to her community. And that's where the healing really takes place. I saw Ken with his hand up.
In the message, it says she told the whole story. And somewhere along the way, we learned about all the doctors that she'd been to and
Yes.
all the money and the many years of suffering. I figured that was part of the whole story.
Yes.
That she was sharing.
Yes. She
And
tells the
Jesus
whole thing.
listened to all that.
And that's it. She's telling it to someone who cares to listen. That's the thing. And that's the beauty of this story, because he's in an emergency situation. How many times, if we were in Jesus' shoes, would we have done the same thing? Or would we have done it differently? I'll get back to you. I'm too busy. I got to keep going. This is part of what the healing, what the miracle story is. Maybe it's the miracle of Jesus' ability to attend to what's needed and to remain open, despite being directed and in a rush to go somewhere. He was still open enough to receive and to see beyond what the rest of the world sees. That's a very important part of how Jesus heals. He sees maybe better than anyone else. And I think we know how many times, if we had just seen something differently or seen someone differently, it might have opened up a possibility of real love and connection and even healing. And not because of us creating it, but of us initiating it and the Spirit of God being allowed to enter in. And that's when it all breaks open. Was there another comment? Oh, yes, Jane?
It just made me think about all the people out there in the world that really want to be seen and known, whether it's homeless people, whether it's people of other races or cultures, because they have felt isolated or shunned or so many things. And, we've probably all been blessed to be seen and known by people, by family and friends. And I certainly have. And I think, oh man, the people that haven't, and I have a neighbor lady that fits both of these stories, and it's just heartbreaking as I think about her and my relationship with her,
Yeah. Yeah, it opens us up to seeing people maybe that are already in our lives with a different perspective. It also opens us up to maybe be receptive to others that we don't know, to see them differently. And the other truth is, sometimes bleeding is apparent, the way we hemorrhage, but then sometimes it's hidden. On a physical level, it can be internal, but there's also ways that we are hemorrhaging, even if we appear to be healthy. And what you named, Jane kind of brought it up in terms of homelessness and other maybe designations in our society that sort of are the cast-asides, the ones that we kind of look at with love, but also sometimes pity. And sometimes I'll get to that later. This opens us up to see all those ways that maybe a part of us is already that too. That what is it in us that has been hemorrhaging, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual? It's a part of life. And we all walk through our days, or many of us walk through our days, and we're sort of, maybe pretending is the wrong word, but we're hiding, or we're not sharing the whole story. And that's partly out of protection. It's not to say that it's wrong, but there are a lot of ways that we are all hemorrhaging. That somehow there is bleeding, where we are not at a whole, we're not at a whole sustainable level. And so many times our world and our circumstances in our world contribute to that. We started talking about that to me is part of the legacy of COVID. That it really has created sort of this sense of isolation that we need to, we're bridging those gaps again. And that's why it feels good to be in community again. But we have to relearn how to do that. And then how to share ourselves. And to know and to trust that maybe someone cares to know what we have to say. It's all part of healing. It's all part of humanity and community. And that's part of what this story, I think, opens up for her. That's where she discovers it too. Did I see a hand up? Yeah, Ken?
I recently read the book as part of a book group called The Least of These that talks about the amount of addiction in our society, and most recently the problems with fentanyl. But one of the big problems that he talks about is that people often aren't able to talk about their problems relating to addiction, and rare will you ever see an obituary, for example, that would reveal that it was because of taking a pain medication that person died.
Yeah.
And so there's a significant stigma in our society that are leaving people isolated and not able to feel a sense of community and support because of the problems that are addressing their life and even causing them to even lose life on some occasions.
Right. How many times in our own lives, rather than telling the whole story and seeking deeper connection and relationship, do we seek to resolve our problems, not solve them, but resolve them by numbing ourselves? Alcohol, drugs, escapism, sex, whatever. There's a lot of ways we do it that seek to numb or to overwhelm or distract us from that. And what I love about this story is that it really seems to, she just, in very few verses, she just goes there to where it's most important to reveal. But again, it's not just her revealing, it's Jesus being there to receive it. And that is so important. That's that two-way street. That's the place, that's where the alchemy of healing happens. It's in relationship. We see this time and again throughout the Gospels. It's just another example. One more example. So in a sense then, similar to this woman, are there things that keep you from stepping forward to tell your whole story? Whether to Jesus or to someone else, in a way that might release you from whatever it is. We call it hemorrhage, but whatever it is that will free you, that will open you. What are the things that keep you from stepping forward and telling that whole story? Because that's where it gets real. Anything come to mind?
Well, yeah, fear of being ostracized.
Right.
I'll use Ken's board that he had out front as an example.
Yeah.
Everybody put pins in, oh yeah, I really, for all the climate change, those people that aren't quite sure. Didn't put pins on.
Yes, thank you. So Dan was saying, sometimes we don't share our whole self because we don't want to be ostracized or judged for our perspectives or our beliefs. And isn't it, it's such an honest comment. We're in church Every Sunday, we talk about you are accepted and loved here for who you are, not for what you believe, not for what you say. And yet our world teaches us differently. And that's what's always in tension. The world of church seeks to welcome and not judge. But we know that we're still human and judging happens. It does. And when you get burned by being judged, it just makes it that much harder. So that fear of being ostracized or judged that's a huge one. It's a real one. Anyone else? What are some other things that keep you from wanting to or being able to reveal your whole story, either to Jesus or to others? 40.
Sometimes parts of the story are so painful that it's difficult to visit that pain again at all publicly, let alone with someone else.
That's true. Yeah, there's a sense that kind of to revisit it in words is to reopen a wound sometimes. And only the person who's going through that knows the difference. Sometimes those stories need to come out. Sometimes it is a crutch to not tell them, but a lot of times it's just painful and it just opens it up because there are things that often happened in our past that we can't change. And we just need to come to a certain sense of acceptance that there will be a scar there. And the scar is never going to be that same pristine flesh or whatever that it was before. Yes, we can function, but to tell that story is to tear open that darn scar again. It doesn't feel good. So that's another big one. That's another big one. And again, there are times when you do tell it, when you do share those stories, when you find those right moments or people, sometimes it does happen. And sometimes it feels good. Sometimes we have what I call a vulnerability hangover when we do that. And it takes us right to that place again. And the vulnerability hangover is, oh no, I've revealed too much. And now they know me. Now they see. Darn it, I can't take it back. That's a tough one. That's a tough one.
An example of what you just did is the Vietnam warriors with their post-traumatic distress.
Yes. Yes. And that was a double-edged sword. So Dan brought up the experience of Vietnam soldiers. And it's probably true well beyond that, but that's such a powerful example. Not only was the post-traumatic stress that they dealt with absolutely traumatic for them, where they didn't want to share it. It is very difficult to have sort of folks that lived through some of those traumatic events to want to talk about it. But then to be met by a world that judged them as baby killers and rapists and murderers and all that, it doubly created this sense of isolation. And look, the feelings that we have about a war are certainly much larger than the individuals. And unfortunately, the individuals pay the price that the countries, the politicians, the machines of war deserve to pay. That's the sad thing. But it's so instructive that if we can keep that in perspective and somehow love the people, despite all the stuff that we've been told, even if it may be true. See, that's the thing, is that sometimes, if we're all honest, there's parts of our stories that we're not proud of. Now, I don't know, it almost, I don't know, does it matter if there's a scale? I'm not worried about a scale. I'm just saying that there's going to be parts of all our stories that we would be ashamed of. But then can we find that place, that person, that relationship with God, that community, where it can somehow be opened, that we might be able to move forward as a whole person, or towards being a whole person? That's one of the big failures of the example of the Vietnam War, is that we never allowed that to happen. And you saw the results. You saw the results of that, which is just a lot of drug abuse, a lot of addiction, a lot of homelessness, a lot of mental illness, that sort of thing. And this is sort of, these biblical stories kind of present, this idea, a lot of these physical ailments can be metaphors for some of these same things. Any other comments, any other thoughts about what it is that holds you back from sharing your sort of whole story? I saw 40. Yeah.
I just wanted to backtrack just a small amount. Some of the reading and listening that I've been doing lately of the terrible epidemic of shooters are often remembered as people who were not seen and said, I'm going to do this horrific thing, so I will be seen, I will be noticed, I will be remembered. You know, that's like the epitome of exactly what you're talking about not happening.
Yeah. That's a big part of it too. And the conversation in certain areas of our country make even talking like what you just said so difficult, because it's so wrapped up in feelings about, well, the gun companies, gun control, all that stuff. And then what about the person that did it? What about family life? What about their situation, their isolation? All of it's real and all of it's relevant. But we get too, it's very difficult for us to have these types of conversations because we get wrapped up in certain areas or fields of being, entrenched, and then it makes it difficult to receive that. But this is what we're talking about. When we see someone like the example of, say, a school shooter, that's one of the hardest ones in a lot of ways for us to feel forgiving about. Maybe we feel forgiving towards the child, but we find somewhere to place our anger. Often it's the parents. Something happens in there where we have to rationalize. And the rationalization is natural. But what this story and what I'm trying to get to, what I'm talking about is it doesn't get us closer to healing. It continues to create just the same, it just keeps it going. It doesn't stop anything. And so that's where, that sort of being open, being vulnerable, being able to meet each other, being able to have the difficult conversations, to tell the whole truth, not filtered by all these other agendas, but somehow engage that. That's where we have the chance to move through some of these. Anyone else? It's been pretty fruitful. Dan?
Well, it's not exactly on that, but I was struck by Jesus, with all of his aura and knowledge, couldn't recognize this girl. Why couldn't he have turned and said, daughter, come to me? He couldn't recognize her. I find that a little puzzling.
I'm looking back now at this. Dan's talking about one of the things that was puzzling in this story for him was that Jesus didn't seem to recognize her. Do you think it was something that he couldn't do? Or do you feel like in the context of the story, it was almost like it had to be that way?
I don't know. I get that sense.
That it had to be that way?
Yeah, for some, that he was, it was a way of calling her. Let her take the initiative. I see you, daughter, but I want you to take the initiative and grow your faith.
I really resonate with that. And think about it this way. Thank you, Jay. It's like, how we often say, hey, you can't help someone that's not ready to help themselves, that sort of thing. I don't mean to be trite, but in this sense, this woman had to step forward with a sense of at least initial acceptance of herself that she could step out into public and do this. Whether it was desperation or what, she had enough gumption to do it. And there's something there that showed Jesus that she was ready. If she's going to stay back in the shadows, she's not ready to be healed. She's not ready to be welcomed back in. And how many times has that been true for us, where we are just not ready? Someone can welcome us in, but if we're not ready to go, it ain't going to happen. That's part of this woman's story. So I think it could be quite intentional that it happens that way. Jane?
But Jesus said he felt the power lead him. So to me, I felt like she was already healed just from the initial touch. I always have thought that she was healed from the initial touch of his cloak. The power shifted from Jesus to her. Then Jesus turns and is looking, who could this be?
Yes.
And she already knew she'd been healed. So she fell to her knees at his feet in humility and gratitude that she'd been healed.
Yes.
That's how I feel.
That's how
And I do believe that is true. And the story is playing on this idea that she receives her physical healing right there. There's that power. And it says right after that, her hemorrhaging dried up. But that wasn't the end of her healing.
his blessing came after that.
Yes, well, the healing is always about, and you'll see this in so many of the stories. Yes, there's a physical component. Yes, I can see again, but what does that seeing allow me to do? It allows me to be connected to my family, to my community. He heals her physically, which allows her to then be a part of. He calls her daughter. She tells her whole story. She is able to be a part of things. And that's what matters. That's where the healing happens. It's all of that wrapped up. Healing is not just that physical cure aspect. Honey, do you have?
Yeah, that was what I was trying to put out there.
Yeah.
It's like she was physically healed, but she also had to be spiritually healed because one is not the both.
Yes, it is not the same thing. And I think we all grapple with that. Like, that's part of what I was saying before, there's times in our lives where we receive partial healing, whether we're ready to do it emotionally, but we haven't felt it physically, all these different things. So it's kind of a recognition that there's a multiple steps here. There's multiple pieces of our healing. And so I think that's hopeful, because it's not just about our physical healing, but it's about our sense of connection to something greater than us, to a community, to people who love us, who care to see and hear us, to God, who is all of that with us all the time. See, that's the other part of this story. That's the story of faith. It's not just about her faith, but this is what God's love is like. No matter who we are, even if we've been pushed to the side, to the margins, forgotten, not named, anything, we feel the most insignificant. To God, we are still daughter. We are still part of. We are still loved. That's the healing. Boys?
I just wonder also if it was important, since there were other people around, Jesus knew she was healed, she knew she was healed, but nobody else would unless Jesus brought it forth. And if maybe that was important, that everybody around there that could realize that through their faith, they can also be healed. So it was an announcement to others. Otherwise, she just would have touched his robe, been healed, and he said, oh, good, she's healed, and moving on down the road. But this way, everybody there saw, hey, there's a healing, and I can be healed.
Well, there is some of that, but I think if you look at the story again, nobody knows what the heck's happened. That's why when Jesus says, who touched me? That's not really about him wondering the question. He's trying to see where his disciples are, what they saw, okay? We see Jesus, who sees this woman for who she is. The disciples saw nothing. All they saw was like, oh, are you kidding me? You're surrounded by all these people. What are you talking about? So no one really saw the physical part of the healing. But what Jesus drew attention to by calling her daughter, by hearing her, by stopping, all that stuff, that was the healing. That's when everyone else saw that he cared enough about her. Even as he's rushing to go see this important religious leader's daughter to try to save her from the brink of death, that was what was important. That's the teaching moment. And there is healing in that voice, that if we all recognize that there's not, that maybe if we weren't so didn't have our blinders on all the time, but remained open to the movement of the Spirit, that if we weren't so about all our plans and all our intentions all the time, that's where the Spirit of God is allowed to come in. And really, at the end, as we get to different stages in our lives, isn't that what we always come to realize? All these plans, all these things I bought, all these things, these degrees I've attained, they're not bad, they're just not ultimate. They don't measure up to the power of being in family and relationship and community and connection. That's what Jesus invites her back to. And thereby, as we say, boys, all of us, anyone in that crowd. Because the truth is, the disciples and all those crowd people were all isolated. They didn't know what was going on. They're all in their own little world. And Jesus creates something out of that was unexpected. Margaret.
When you first started talking about, I thought how neat it would be if Jesus was here now. And I thought, oh no, that's wrong. he did it at the right time, and he shows us, and we got to learn from him how to be a better person or reach out to somebody. And when you do that, I know it must happen to the rest of you, but you've been rebooted, and it's hard to, you thought they were friends, and yet they failed you. And you gotta go on. I'm sorry, but I guess I was putting it personal. That I wish Jesus was here, but it doesn't matter what generation it is.
Yeah,
We all have our troubles.
thank you, Margaret. And I do think, the way the world and human beings saw that woman, they had let her down. They had failed her in this story. They shunned her. They didn't have to. They had all these customs, though, these purity rules that they thought were more important. And that's what Jesus came to show us, that people are more important than the rules. Okay? People do let us down. But Jesus comes to see us and lift us up so that we might take the chance to risk being in a relationship again. Because even though Jesus may not be physically present with us in the same way that he was in these times of teaching and life on earth, he gave us so many messages like, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there. What does it mean to be gathered in his name? Stories like this, where we see beyond what the world tells us, we see beyond our human failures, we see beyond our limitations, and really see into the Christ nature of each other. That's what it means to be together in Christ's name. And when we do that, that's where I think things break open. And it's not perfect. And we don't put all our stock in relationships with human beings, but relationships with human beings and with creatures of all kinds are what we have. And they are a manifestation of the love of God. We are made in that image. So it's to say that, yes, they're not perfect, but that is a way of discovering and increasing our sense of wholeness and relationship to each other and to God. Was there one more hand that I saw? This has been a very rich conversation. Horty.
I was just struck by the fact that he didn't tell her what to do with the healing. And that I think that some of us have been on both sides of this coin in sharing. We're burdened by other people's opinions of what we ought to do, or we're in the opinion giving mode. And he let that be, he let that evolve. He just let that happen in the space that was there. He held the space for that becomingness.
Yeah. And I think that's so beautifully said, Horty. I resonate with that. And I see that so often in Jesus. In fact, he never tells someone what to do. You'll hear comments about, okay, now don't tell anybody. And some of us find that confusing, but maybe to say a comment like that is just as simple as saying, you know what, don't tell everyone yet, because let them discover their own becoming, their own type of healing. Yes, you can inspire one another by sharing those stories, but they also can become sort of, oh, well, that's how it happens. Well, no, that's how it happened for me. But my own discovery of healing and growth in that way will be my own. So in a sense, it's this double edge here that he seems to be acknowledging. Now, I know there's other reasons that he says that in the context of the Gospels, but that idea of not telling everybody your story, or at least your healing and the way it specifically happened, is to at least leave the door open for them to discover that for themselves. Hi, Bob. Go ahead. It's Bob Childs.
Oh, I was listening, and that seems, what you're saying there seems to help answer Dan's question, why Jesus asked who touched. He's trying to get, like you say, other people to realize.
Yes, it allows her to step forward and articulate a sense of her identity and her sort of worth as a human being, her dignity, but also it helps others in the story to see differently. It's not just this crowd of nameless, faceless people, but these are all potential connections, relationships that can then be a source of healing for us. Okay. Let's move on to the next one, because this one has some good stuff too. So this is Luke chapter 13, and this is the brief story of the bent over woman. And I just want to start by asking, what does this woman's presence, we'll call it a synagogue, but in the religious house of worship, what does her presence there tell us about? Just tell us about her. What does the fact that she's there say about her?
She wants to be healed.
Possibly. But why do we go to a house of worship?
To be close to God.
Yes, it's a place that allows for an expression of faith, which definitely leads you down the path of being healed. But despite her limitations and her ailment, her faith has not at least been thrown out. We're not told how much faith or whatever, but we've also learned quickly in the Gospels that it doesn't matter how much faith you have. She has enough faith to be there.
Or she's looking.
She may be searching for something, but she's got enough faith to show up. And that is that initial, remember when Carol at the beginning brought up this whole idea of, well, there's a tension here that in the first story, the woman who's bleeding has the initiative. And in this story, it seems to be Jesus' initiative because she never asks for her healing. And yet maybe the story, by saying just that first line, maybe that's her initiative. That she is there as a person with some vestige of faith, some vestige of hope, some desperation to be healed. That may be enough. But she's just even there. Dan.
Well, were women allowed in the synagogue?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Synagogues were different than the temple, but synagogues would have been after the fall of the temple. Synagogues would have been that more house church style. So they had different rules. So they would have absolutely been allowed to be there. In the temple, they were allowed in certain areas, but still allowed into the temple grounds. But in the synagogue, it was just a little bit different. It was a little more, because once the temple was destroyed, that's when it became sort of this more rabbinic style, this synagogue style of Judaism.
So is that the same today?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. So in Reform Judaism,
What level of Judaism you're in?
yes, or what? So you have conservative, you have Orthodox, you have Reform. There are women rabbis. We had Susan Conforti come here to do our Seder. Yeah, so in Reform Judaism, but then in certain ones that have a much different, totally different rules.
Yeah.
But there was this tendency to have women sit in their area and men sit in
Right.
another area.
Right, absolutely. There's still a sense of segregation for sure, but it was at least a different type of welcome. You were saying at least be in the same general space where the worship would be happening, not just like separated into all these other areas like the temple was. But why do you think then? Let's just to follow this through. Why do you think Jesus does heal her before she even asks for it? In this case. Why does the story sort of tell us that, yeah, she didn't really ask for healing, but Jesus took care of it in this instance? What is that trying to say to us?
Well,
Jane?
to me, then because they said she had an evil spirit in her, meaning she had some sort of demons or mental illness. And maybe Jesus recognized that due to her mental illness, she couldn't come to him of her own free will. I mean, mental illness takes people down very deep paths that are very difficult and challenging for them.
Yes, so Jane is saying that maybe it's a suggestion that Jesus saw something in her that required his initiative to act, to stimulate the healing, to at least begin there, to take place. Yeah, that could be a part of it. What else might it be saying?
Teaching by example.
How so?
Well, he's in church. He wants to make a point. He is a teacher. This is one way to do it, by physical example.
Yeah, he is taking this woman who is already there, So she has already shown some measure of willingness, I guess some initiative, taking her who is there and resolving something. And there's something powerful about the timing. By not asking for it, it could be an indication that sometimes our healing can come in surprising ways and times. It's not always on our schedule. It's not something we always ask for and then receive. We know this. How many times are we, and this is not a judgment, we are praying for cures so many times. And what we discover is that our healing happens oftentimes not connected to a cure. And that sometimes we discover wholeness in our lives, even when certain physical parts of us are falling apart and breaking down. Jesus takes this as an opportunity, an example, to sort of lift her up, even before she's able to or willing to ask for it. Did I see a hand on the screen? Birdie. And then,
yeah. It's also one way that Jesus can show us that he knows each one of us and he knows of our needs.
Yes. Yeah. That no matter what our circumstances, whatever has happened in our past, he is there with us, knows us, sees us, loves us.
Yes.
But there's no way that we are separated from that. That's powerful medicine for sure. Terry?
So is he trying to come into the synagogue and show how powerful he is? For non-believers to show his presence?
Well, I do think in the context of these stories, he's often being questioned by the religious authorities, and where his power and his authority is being sort of, there's a tension there. But Jesus is never about sort of demonstrating his Herculean power. He will demonstrate that he has a sense of authority, but it's never only about him. He tries to make it so it's always connected. Your faith has made you well. I am a conduit for that. I am connected to the one who is the healer, but God heals through me, kind of thing. Jesus is never about trying to claim all the attention for himself. And that's why the healings, I think, are always that sort of relationship on some two-way street. Bonnie?
I was thinking that unlike the first woman who nobody really recognized that she had the problem, Jesus knew. This woman had a very obvious problem that everyone would recognize as soon as they looked at her. I don't know if the spirit part, if she had any kind of odd behaviors, but certainly her, the physical fact that she was bent over was very, very noticeable. And it would have been easier for her in many ways to just not be there, to say, I can't go out, people might make fun of me, it's too much trouble, you know, it's difficult to get around, whatever, that a lot of times we do, we make these excuses, well, I can't do this or that because of whatever. But she was there, Jesus was there, and that was important to her to be in the synagogue when he was, you know, when he was present. And I'm sure that he recognized that, and it was, I don't want to say reward, that's not the right word, but it was a demonstration that her faith and her actions were really important and important to him.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he saw her and loved her, and then there was something that happened in her that was very distinct. Yes, you could easily recognize this woman when you have that sort of an ailment, and then the way the healing happens. So tell me this. So we see what Jesus does, and then how is the woman's response to the healing instructive to us? How is how she responds instructive? How does it communicate what healing looks like?
Giving glory to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's praising God. And how many times, like think about your own lives, how easy it is to be so connected to God when we are in the foxhole, in the hell of life. And then as soon as something positive happens, oh, that's great. I'm and that energy, that focus of her on the praise aspect, it's like we're cultivating the spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving and connection, because what it does is it reminds her that her life, her wholeness, her healing, her power Her dignity is not wrapped up in herself. It is wrapped up in all that is around her, in something more than her, even if it's just one more, even if it's just God. We say just, but it's not ever just about us. That's where her healing comes. See the connection between both these stories. So many of these stories, it's all about we find our full healing. Yes, we get physically healed. That's a metaphor, or that's a help, that's a starter. But what does it lead to? It leads to something that draws us into deeper, more powerful, whole, loving community. That's where healing guides us. And if we're not finding ourselves drawn there, then it's an opportunity for us to look at ways to continue our healing, to find that. What do you?
At the risk of sounding completely facetious, which I am at the moment, it certainly showed that she could change her viewpoint, her position. She went from being bent over to looking, she took a new position. She was standing upright.
Yeah.
She wasn't any longer looking like down between her legs or looking at the floor or looking at things upside down, whatever it was. She literally has a new position on things.
That's right. And it raises the question, of the whole experience of being bent over, of being hunched. It means that we can't fully see what is out in front of us. And by her being made upright, it's not just the physical upright, it's the spiritual, it's the emotional. And so it allows us to consider what are the ways that our culture, our society, and even on a small scale, our family dynamics can contribute to a bent overness. And how is it then that how might we be able to stand or straighten? How would we experience that spiritually? What would it look like to feel that emotionally? Where are those places in our culture that make us or others feel bent over? To pay attention to those, because when we see bent over people, whoever said that, you're right, it's easy to see them, but all of us are bent over spiritually in one way or another, or emotionally. And until we have those eyes to see that, then how will we ever be a part of mutual, standing straight? Because that's part of it. Again, that's relationship. That's when we dare and step in to those places where we maybe don't see, or where it'd be easy for us to say, I'm not going to go there today. And look, that happens. That's real. That's fine. But what about the next opportunity? Where is it that we find these places in our culture or in our lives that make it hard for us, that bend us over? And then how do we move out of that? How do we see differently? Not only for our own sake, but again, once we experience that, how then do we bring that out? How do we, what's the praise, that we offer? That's the life song. That's what we are all here for in a lot of ways. On this earth, at church, connected in relationships of love. This is what it's about. Mutual standing up, lifting up, speaking out. Barbara.
Well,
and then voice.
It sort of reminds me that the woman who was bent over never saw people's faces and never looked them in the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think I'm scurrying into the grocery store and my head is down and I don't look at anybody. I've just got myself fixated on what I'm doing. And that's when you miss, I think, the possibilities of healing for yourself.
You can, absolutely. Yeah, what are the ways that we stay bent over and not able to really see our own lives or the people around us? Boys, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something still?
Sure. The word patient seems to come to me, that here this woman, probably for years, this has been coming on her. It didn't just happen overnight that she got arthritis. And she's just been patient. She's not complaining. She's not whining. She doesn't blame God. She still believes, and she's come to this Sabbath meeting place. She still has hope, but it's just like she has been patient for years, and all of a sudden she is healed and able to stand up and be upright, and so that word just seems she demonstrated a lot of patience.
Yeah, and I want to say that she may have been all those things you described, but the story doesn't tell us, and I think it's quite intentional, that she might have been a complainer. She might have really wanted to lash out, but that's all acceptable. If you forget, go read Job again. Go read so many other of the sort of stories of the heroes of the faith. They complain all the time.
Because they're men and she was patient.
That's why you're studying religion. Looks like we've all learned a lot of important things. That being that's the number one. The story doesn't tell us these details, and that's where it's like maybe it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we were doing then. We didn't know. We don't know how she used her voice before she came to that synagogue. But what we know is she was there then. She was seen. She experienced a straightening, and she went out praising. And there's that story that said it doesn't matter what your journey has been to this point. Yes, I love it. I accept it. I want to see it, but it doesn't define you. You are a daughter of God. Go forth and live, be whole. That's what that story is sort of saying to me. And again, it could be that she was all patient, because I love that. I love the play on words there. The patient. But I also think there's room for the complaining patience. I'm one of them. Was there a hand out here? No. Then was there another hand on the Zoom screen? All right, well, friends, this has been a really wonderful entry into these great stories. This is kind of how it'll roll, where we'll get a little bit into the biblical aspect of it and what we can glean from it, but then also really tapping into our life and experiences of life and food. So thank you for all of your contributions. Next week, we'll be reading Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 to 17, and then Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. I'll put it on the recording. It's already on the schedule that was sent out by email, but we also have them in the church office. I'll have a stack of them for anyone who wants to get them. So thank you all for being here today. Blessings.